It's all good. It's in gentlemen, Derek Lambert, MythVision podcast. Welcome back. Don't forget, we are MythVision. We're going to talk about the resurrection, of course, continuing our series with Jonathan M.S. Pierce and his book, A Critical Examination, right here. Let me not let it be blurry. Make sure you go get you a copy. Having fun. Of the Easter story. We're going to do the nativity story next. I said, why not? You know what? I was supposed to go at 10. Then Jonathan was like, dude, I live in another country. Daylight savings time happened for you guys. Like, what hour are we living in at this point?
Essentially, I got it wrong and it's my fault. And we're on an hour earlier than we probably should be. And that means that there's going to be no one watching, but I'm really sorry. Sue me.
Nah, it's all good, man. There's always someone lingering around ready to get their myth fix. Let's let everybody know up front before we get started. I'm going to go ahead and let them see the intro. The naked Jesus is really why everyone came here. We're pretty sure. I want to show you an intro that I had made, and then we're going to do your intro, and then we're going to get into this. Here.
We are MythVision. By the way, they lied about me.
Did you notice the water turned into wine?
Nice.
Yeah, man. That's really Jesus. Make sure you guys go join the Patron at MythVision. You're not only helping us grow, you can ask questions, steer the direction of particular questions you want towards scholars. And of course, I have hundreds of videos that are not on actual YouTube that have found their way onto Patron. I'd say there's at least 300 videos that have never seen the light of day on the YouTube. And there might be more than that. You just go all the way down, and then you hit load more, and et cetera, et cetera. You can also harass me in the message section if you want to private message me or whatever. Also, go to a Tippling Philosopher's YouTube channel. I'm going to post this right now in the chat so everybody can go there. Subscribe as we go along. Please remind our friends to go and check out Jonathan's YouTube channel. This gives him a reason to come back. All right, here it goes. Dropping that. What's up, everybody in the chat? I'll check you guys out here in a moment, and we're going to get into this subject matter. The chapter we're dealing with is a tomb, an empty tomb. But one more thing. Go to Amazon, type in Jonathan's name, and here you have it. You've got a bunch of his books that start popping up. You can scroll down. You name it, it's on there. The one that we're talking about is at the top. The Resurrection, a critical examination of the Easter story. And delving into the empty tomb, women at the tomb. I mean, like so many different problems that we're trying to look at critically and examine. Does this make sense? Is this historical? Is there a historical kernel? Are some of you who came into the chat saying it's all fiction from the gate? Are you right? I don't know. We'll see what happens with that as we continue. Now, finally, to our naked Jesus intro, and then from there, we will get into the content. Boom, 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 boom.
Do you know of all topics that we've dealt with? Actually, that intro is most relevant for today's one. So
really,
well, yeah. He's emptying the tomb, isn't he?
That's a good point. That is a good point. So tell us what is going on with this chapter in particular. And some people might be just now tuning in. They've never watched the series. Some people probably have, or they haven't seen what we've done so far. A tomb, an empty tomb is what you titled it.
Yeah, so this is chapter number 15. So we've already done an awful lot of chapters, laying the groundwork, looking at all the claims within the Gospels and Paul concerning the resurrection, the whole Easter story. We've got the arrest, the capture, the trial of Jesus. We've got all the claims about how he was executed. We've got Barabbas being freed, but Jesus not. And then, we come on to the execution and then the burial. And that now we get to, well, what happens after the burial? Now we've looked at all of these different claims, and we have found them to be really, really problematic. And one of the baseline kind of mechanisms that we use, and we talked about this in the very first video, was extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that is something that I think is pretty much indisputable. And I think once you take that on board and say, well, intuitively, this is something I use every day. If someone at the water cooler tells me a crazy story about jumping off Mount Everest and then flying and then coming to land on their feet, then I'm going to say, well, I'm going to need an absolutely shed load of evidence to support that claim. I'm not going to believe it unless I get that evidence. But if someone at the water cooler said, oh, do you know what? I went shopping yesterday. I'm not going to say, I don't believe you. I need an absolute ton of evidence that you went shopping yesterday. So it's intuitively true that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And then, so that's what we've used to help us sort of dissect the story so far. Now we have Jesus having been buried in a tomb, which is itself problematic and almost certainly didn't happen. And that's what we talked about in the last episode. Also, we talked about Matthew's guards at the tombs, but in the episode before, we talked about how he wouldn't have been buried in a tomb.
They had a common criminal graveyard where they would, place the criminals, not give them an honorary burial.
Yeah,
let alone.
We're not 100% sure with Jerusalem, because it was sort of pretty much destroyed after the fall of Jerusalem, but he either would have been buried in a shallow grave, but that's probably unlikely pragmatically, because you'd have to have a massive shallow grave for someone like Jerusalem. So it's more likely a necropolis, which is an arrangement of sort of mortuary holes, if you like, these loculi, where they would have placed the bodies in, and then after a year, if the family wanted to rebury the bones for a proper burial, a more honorable burial, the bones would have been ritually purified over the years, so they wouldn't be like criminals' bones anymore, so they wouldn't defile the ground, so they could bury those bones in a family tomb. You wouldn't have had a criminal buried straight away in a tomb and left in a nice new rock-hewn empty tomb, with all its honor, given that this was the highest form of crime, this kind of high treason, blasphemy. This is the worst form, and there's all the Jewish law that we know from the Mishnah, and all these oral traditions that were written down. We know that wouldn't have been how Jesus would have been buried. But here we are. This is where the Gospels lead us.
Right. I mean, more and more as I look into this, the narrative is painting it. It seems highly fictional, the way that they're actually describing these things as happening in the Gospels, the way that they're describing them. It's almost like we don't care about your traditions. We don't care. Like, we're taking a much more lenient approach to the Torah, and it might be leaning in that Pauline direction. It could be. I'm not saying we can't be absolutely confident on things, but there's that Paul within Judaism school, and then there's Paul who's actually trying to say, as the commentator of Acts, for example, would say, Paul's saying, I'm no longer a Jew at all. Like, you know what? Scratch that whole system, that old system. He was considered a Jew, but he's now like saying, look, that law is old, and we're all coming to a new body. We're becoming a new people. This kind of idea that comes a little bit later. I wonder if the Gospels are kind of taking that jab.
Almost certainly. So there's going to be an element where the Gospels, because you've got to remember, Paul was writing a lot closer to the death of Jesus. So him taking a step away from Judaism is a much bigger thing, because with say Mark going on to John, where you've got anywhere up to maybe 80 to 90 years after Jesus has died, depending on what your dating is, but with Mark maybe 40 years, you have already had that amount of time to allow for development of early Christianity. So all of that time is for people to step away from Judaism in that area. But then you're talking about diaspora sort of Judaism, where some of these people we don't know 100% where and when the Gospels were written. We've got some pretty educated guesses, but they're going to be in communities that aren't necessarily within, say, Jerusalem, which is obviously heavily Jewish, and so everyone's going to know their Jewish law, and everyone's going to be absolutely embedded within Jewish culture.
Right.
You're in Hellenized Jewish kind of communities who aren't necessary, but you are also within a Christian sect. So imagine you're writing a gospel maybe 50 years after Jesus died in a different country within a different community which isn't wholly Jewish. And then you can then start understanding why they might get some of the Jewish laws wrong, where they might misunderstand how certain things would have taken place back in Jerusalem, back in that time. So it's both a step away from Judaism in the way that Paul is saying, I'm going to create a new form of Judaism. This is Christianity. And it's also the idea that here, actually, a long time later, here are people who aren't born into a Jewish community, they're born into a Christian community, or they're coming into a Christian community, maybe not from an overtly Jewish background, they're Gentiles or whatever. So a whole load of different things going on, where you aren't necessarily going to be verifying every claim that's being made or able to verify every claim that's made. So I think it's important to understand the context of.
So that would be, I mean, take us into this particular chapter, because when I talked to Delcy Allison Jr., of course, and trying to get different thoughts, he thinks that it's not a large step from he was buried, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul, to, well, he was buried in a tomb. And here's this tomb. You see what I'm saying? Which, of course, that doesn't equate, but he's saying he sees continuity. But in this chapter, you're talking about an empty tomb. We already have all these other pauses that make us kind of hold on. He was buried in an empty tomb. What are you talking about? Like, well, buried in a tomb, like by Joseph of Arimathea and whatnot. And then here he is. It's empty. Tell us what goes on in this chapter.
Well, Paul's saying he's buried is like, well, whatever, of course, So I think that's pretty understandable.
He could have been buried 10 different ways.
Exactly, and of course he's going to be buried. He's a dead body. Unless he's resurrecting there and then in front of everyone, like at the cross, then of course he's going to be buried. So I think it is a big step from he's buried to an empty tomb, because actually there's no precedent for someone being executed for that kind of crime to have a tomb like this. So the question is, what is the empty tomb doing? What's its place in the narrative?
Right.
We'll come on to this in a later video, but even sort of Bart Ehrman's accepting. There's a really good chapter in The Empty Tomb, which is a great book, Jesus Beyond the Grave, edited by Robert Price and Jeff Lauder. I think it's 2005 book, but it's a really, really good book, that. And Richard Carrier's got a chapter in there on how he thinks that the resurrection of Jesus was understood by Paul to be more of a spiritual resurrection, where he says it's a transforming body, but the original body of Jesus would remain in its burial place, right? So, for example, if that was a tomb, it would remain in the tomb. So the empty tomb is not only part of the overall narrative that has loads of functions for the story, but it also might have some really big theological functions, which is to say, if Paul believed that there was a body that was left behind, and he believes that there's kind of like some kind of Gnostic beliefs that there was this spiritual resurrection, and the later gospel writers disagreed with that theology, and they're stepping away from what Paul was thinking, especially John, when we get to John, then the empty tomb becomes more important, because it's saying it's an empty tomb, which means that there was a body there and there is no longer a body there. Mm-hmm. This is a bodily resurrection, and it is the original body that Jesus had that has resurrected. So it's saying something theological, and this is why later John goes on to say, and he eats broiled fish, like I keep talking about, and Thomas is poking him. That's not anything to do with Thomas per se. That's the way of John saying to the audience, this is a body. This is a human body that was resurrected.
Right.
And it's not what Paul was thinking, which was more of a spiritual resurrection. But we'll get onto that in a later video. So that's to give you some context of why the empty tomb is important, but also it allows for witnesses to come. It allows for verification from apostles. It allows for angels to be there, your deus ex machina, like, this narrative literary mechanism of them being able to deliver some information. It's a really useful thing, the empty tomb. It's
so
not
one of the problems I have with this whole empty tomb narrative, and just being frank, I want to just be as common sense as we can, is you have the earliest narrative that we have of this situation of an empty tomb. We have Mark, and it's a woman who's headed to the empty tomb. What is she trying to do? What is her whole goal in going to the empty tomb? Because if what I understand that the tomb was sealed off, what's she doing? Is she going there to go meet some Roman soldiers or people to roll away the stones?
I'll tell you what, we'll get onto that bit later, because that's actually the next chapter is women and the empty tomb.
Okay, because
that is like, it's all wrapped up with each other, because obviously chronologically you've got the women discovering the empty tomb. But right. Let's just understand that the empty tomb is this, I think, this functional thing for the gospel writers to enable them to deliver some theology, but as well as that, a load of a story. Now, William Lane Craig sees the empty tomb as a pretty important thing. So I suppose before we start, because I know we started, we've been going a long time, but there's this idea of motivated reasoning.
Right.
What do skeptics lose, right, if the empty tomb is true? So answering that question. So if you were convinced that there was, absent of everything else, there was an empty tomb, right, in this story, right?
And Jesus was actually buried in that tomb.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So what do you lose? Does it mean that definitely the resurrection happened?
No,
not at all. Because there are other ways of getting to skepticism of the resurrection.
Many other ways.
Yeah. Swoon theory, so that he thought he was dead but wasn't dead, just walked out the tomb.
Temporary burial and moved into a new location.
Two-body hypothesis, yeah. Temporarily buried in the tomb, and then, yeah, exactly. So there are lots of ways of getting there. So it's not the be all and end all. So we're not massively motivated to say, yes, the empty tomb has to be false. We're like, it probably is false, because do you know what? The rest of it's false. But for the theist here, for the Christian here, they are very much motivated by having the empty tomb being true, because without the empty tomb, you don't really get proof that Jesus resurrected. You don't get verification that Jesus resurrected, like there, you don't get the guards at the tomb, you don't get the angels, you don't get the woman seeing it, there's an empty tomb, you don't get the apostles coming and verifying it. And so this whole thing, it's not absolutely necessary for the resurrection belief that Christians have, but it is somewhat important. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. If you pull, it's like Jenga, like the little tower we have in the intro.
Yeah.
You start pulling off one block at a time, and these are some pretty heavy blocks. There's some weight leaning on these blocks. Sure, someone can believe if they wanted to try and like allow for, well, we don't have to have that. He still appeared, as 1 Corinthians said, he appeared to many or whatever. But yeah, what do you do with that? Like, you start seeing flaws. Why are we still holding on to this?
Yeah, so of course, this doesn't have any impact on whether it's true or not. But what it does tell you is what it explains is why people like William Lane Craig fight really hard to establish the empty tomb. Like, it's one of the cornerstones of his historical evidential approach to the resurrection claims, and why he defends the resurrection so strongly, or it's part of how he defends it so strongly. He relies quite heavily on the empty tomb. Is that something you've come across with your knowledge of William Lane Craig? I don't know how much you've looked into him.
Well, yeah, he has the same, what do you call it, modus operandi every time he debates. It's the same written, structured format in which he argues the same thing Well, we know that there were, he has this poetic way
Yeah.
of debating, and he's an orator. But at the end of the day, yes, that is significant because he wants to assume this is an early witness to the fact that the tomb was empty. Well, it has to be explained how. So then the leap to him is people experienced him risen from the dead. What's the logical conclusion, right, to them?
Well, he gives 8 reasons that I'm going to quote you that he thinks
Please.
the empty tomb is really important, and
these are in here?
why yes. So this is page 193 to 194. So these
Okay.
are the eight reasons he gives. 1, Paul's account suggests the historical authenticity of the empty tomb. Okay, I find that a bit problematic. 2, the existence of the empty tomb text in the pre-Markham Passion narrative supports its historical authenticity. 3, the usage of on the first day of the week rather than on the third day indicates a primitiveness of the oral history. 4, the account is theologically unembellished and non-apologetic. 5, the finding of the tomb by women is very unlikely. 6, the inspection of the empty tomb by the apostles is historically likely. 7, it would not have been possible for the apostles to declare the resurrection in Jerusalem had the tomb not been empty. And 8, the Jewish polemic presumes the empty tomb. Mm-hmm. That Jewish polemic being how we know that the Jews claim that there was a body stolen. Now, they couldn't claim it was stolen if there was no existing idea of there being an empty tomb. Now, I have a problem with literally every single one of those issues that William Lane Craig states there. But part of it is like, well, do you know what? If the whole story is pretty much false, then the empty tomb is false. It's almost like presupposing this is a rational and a true thing. It's like for me, it's coherent that the empty tomb isn't true because actually that coheres with what we've been doing here in all these videos, which is completely debunking the whole story. And I think the maximum we can probably establish is that Jesus was executed in Jerusalem. And I think as a historicist, I think that's the truth. But I don't think anything else that you read in the Gospels is true particularly. Or there might be elements of some kind of bits of narrative that might have some element of truth, but nothing like is presented in the Gospels.
Right. I think, like you said, you could chip away at those 8 pieces. Even number 1, Paul's account suggests a historical authenticity of the empty tomb.
I don't really understand
that leap we were talking about. Right. He just says he was buried. He doesn't say how. He doesn't say where. He doesn't say when. He doesn't even mention women going to it, right? Which we're going to get into that in the next chapter. But but there's like this. No, that's you already taking your final full understanding of all the Gospels in your mind, all the story, and combining it into Paul's testimony, which is not taking it in chronological order. You're not really looking at the detail and the development. That's the whole point of why there's critical scholarship. Even Dale Allison Jr. Recognized this and said that most of these Christians they haven't hit the Enlightenment. They're not seeing the problem. They're not recognizing there's a reason that there's critical historical, the whole quest for the historical Jesus. There's a reason that that's the case because there's so much legend. And he even admits there's legend in the New Testament Gospels. Yeah. When I asked Paula Gia's question and, of course, Pine Creek's question. But yeah, it just...
So the problem here is that Paul is just very silent about the empty tomb. He says nothing. In fact, we talked about this in a previous episode where this should be perfect source material for Paul convincing the Corinthians, for example, in his letters to the Corinthians, or whoever he's writing to. You'd think he'd be drawing or at least making allusion to an empty tomb because it's part of the I mean, when we look back at the Jesus story, the empty tomb is a massively important part of the story, right? So surely that would be the case for Paul because he knows the same story, right? so the Christian would say. So, but yet he makes absolutely no mention of the empty tomb or anything to do with the empty tomb, which is, you know, the woman discovering it, the angels there, absolutely nothing. If he's trying to convince people about the resurrection, like he is with the Corinthians, trying to convince them of a certain understanding of the resurrection, he would surely be saying, and we know this, of course, because he discovered at the empty tomb there was nobody, and we know this because he doesn't mention it at all. So where we'd expect him to mention it, he doesn't mention it. And all we get is just a great silence. So I don't think that the point one for William Lane Craig remotely stands up. How does that defend the authenticity? How does Paul's claims defend the authenticity of the empty tomb? So and then this idea that there's a suggestion of a pre-Markan existence of the empty tomb narrative, I would completely contest that as well, because like we said in the last video, Matthew's guards at the tomb were a polemic, were a counter argument from the Jews of Matthew's time against what Mark is claiming. Now, if the empty tomb had existed before Mark, Mark would have had the guards as a counter argument or a counter argument to the Jewish counter argument, right? But because Mark was the first guy to write it, to really express this claim, the Jewish counter arguments came after Mark. And this is why the next gospel writer, Matthew, has the counter argument. So I don't think there was a pre-Markan narrative for the empty tomb. I think it starts with Mark, and I think we've got good reason to suggest it does. So again, I think William Lane Craig's point here is incorrect.
And if I may, to remind myself, what was your explanation for why Luke did not add the guards at the tomb?
Well, we can only guess, right? But I think there's got to be a case of Luke. It depends how Luke was written, whether and whether he definitely had access to Matthew and so on and so forth. But then John most certainly would have done. Why did John not include the? I think it's because they looked at it for what it was. You know, they understood it for what it was, which was just a counter argument. It was a mechanism but they probably thought, this is ridiculous. It doesn't really make sense for all the reasons we talked about in the last video. That I think you can pick quite obvious holes in it, and it looks like just a counter argument.
Mm-hmm. Interesting,
because that's what he says. He says this, and as Jews believe to this day. I mean, Matthew says that we stole the body.
And I wonder if Luke's not concerned with that because maybe Luke's not engaging with Jews. That's another thing, because Luke doesn't seem to give a flying hoot what rabbis are saying at synagogues. He seems to be so divorced from the Jewish world that he's like, I don't care what Jews are saying right now. I mean, he probably isn't even engaging with them. He's writing to Theophilus, whoever the hell that is.
It's a really good point. That's an excellent point, because actually his audience are Gentiles, and so therefore he's not really concerned with, or arguably involved with, as you say, Jewish polemic and Jewish arguments, because he's not writing in that context and for that audience. Matthew is writing for Jews, right, to convince Jews to Christianity. So he's writing to convince the people who are proposing these arguments. Mm-hmm. So he needs to overcome those arguments in order to find purchase with those people. So that's an absolutely fantastic point.
I got a super chat here real quick. My friend, the Dutch Radical. Thank you so much, Aaron. If canonical books are divine, why are there so many questions? No biographies, endless discussions about the canon. All religions start with a mess. Well put. I really do appreciate that. Yeah. Would you comment?
Yeah. So we did talk about this in a previous video to an extent. So we think I think intuitively, when we read the New Testament, we look at all the Gospels and we think all the Gospel writers knew all the other Gospels. So Mark knew John, Mark knew Matthew, Mark knew Luke, Luke knew them all, Matthew knew them all, blah, blah, blah. So we just got 4 slightly different accounts. We don't really picture the idea of when Luke was writing, right, or when Matthew was writing, he only had Mark to go on, right? Luke hadn't written yet, and John hadn't written yet. So Matthew, and not only that, Matthew is writing within his own community. So he may have completely different ideas of what Christianity is to what Mark had, or completely different agendas, or different sources, or whatever. So we've got 4 different things going on, and as a result of that, you have 4 very problematic sources that do not cohere very well. That's why there are so many questions. And so what happens after time? These all get smashed together, and there's a little bit of editing that arguably goes on. To try and harmonize bits here and there, but basically you're smashing 4 stories together and saying these are canonical, and actually that's really problematic, because they are obviously not. But then if you know nothing about Jewish law, right? So you're in the Roman Empire, later on you're in Rome, and you're talking about, like, we're going to do this with the New Testament or that, and you aren't like a Jewish rabbi with huge amounts of contemporaneous knowledge about how the Jewish law worked for execution and burial in Jesus's lifetime, then actually some of these problems that we now later find out are not issues, because actually no one had the internet, no one had ways of verifying these facts with each other. But also, as I said earlier, the individual gospels wouldn't have been verifying each of their claims with other gospels, because they wouldn't have necessarily had the other gospels in order to verify it, in order to make sure that their claims cohere. So it's all very independent, although some gospels were relying on other gospels, but not other gospels relying on those gospels. So
I want to say on this comment, though, yesterday I was watching a discussion between Muhammad Hijab and Dr. Bart Ehrman. And I think Muhammad Hijab was hoping that Bart would side with the Muslims more on the discussion. But, Dr. Ehrman doesn't give a crap, who you are or what your position is. If he disagrees, he's going to tell you why. And that's it. But one of the things was he was trying to explain why the Quran has no contradictions and there's no problems. And he's like, that doesn't make a book divine. He goes, he literally said, the phone book has no contradictions. And I know God didn't write that book, it was really, really good.
It's like Lord of the Rings has no, or some book that someone thinks up coherently as a single author. Of course, it's going to have no contradictions. Doesn't make it. Yeah, absolutely.
But even Bart said, who are you to say that God couldn't have written or been involved or whatever? We have this notion that it has to be perfect. There can't be any flaws. There can't be any problems for it to be from God. He goes, how do you know that? So at the end of the day, he's just saying, how do you know that? So technically this is an interesting question, but one of the reasons we would walk away saying this makes no sense is because there's so many problems between the narratives. You can't say this actually happened, which goes to JoJo's question, was talking about well, you're debunking the literalness of this, sure, but it's a story, sure. I'm okay with that as well. But there's also the strange "this means something completely else" theories, which tries to act like this is all about something other than what you're reading in the narrative itself. Yeah, there's stories, but it seems too much when I get into critical scholarship, when you look between these gospels, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Jonathan, when you compare these gospels, they're trying to nail something down as if this is what happened. That's what it seems to me. They're not writing this as if they're just wanting to create a complete fictional narrative and there's nothing to this in any historical way. It seems like they're trying to make a claim that this is what they believe happened, probably from earlier traditions. And so they made a story narrating it. I do this with my own life. I've done this. I've caught myself telling stories. I mentioned this in the interview. You interviewed me earlier. So everybody go check out his channel. Once again, make sure you go subscribe, because he's going to drop an interview he did with me. But I used to mythologize my own addiction story on how I got clean. And I would conflate days to make it seem more like a universe and God is looking after me and trying to get me clean. I did this with my own story within months of being clean. So imagine 40 years and someone told you, we believe Jesus rose from the dead, and someone's writing a story. Well, he was buried. Okay, well, he was buried. We have an empty tomb. We have a narrative. We have Greco-Roman stories. We have things that we need our Jesus to have done something better, because we know that he did better or something. I don't know.
I would advise everyone to go out and buy my book first, obviously. But if you're going to get another book, so you've mentioned Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Before the Gospels, is brilliant. it's a brilliant book because it talks about how the Gospels were generated, how they were created, and it talks a lot about how memory works. Okay, yeah, that's it. It's a really, really good book. So it talks about how memory works and also oral tradition. And there's this idea that Christians often say, which is, in oral societies where they're not writing a lot down, they're much better at remembering things, and they remember things really accurately. And that's just a fact. And it's not really a fact, and B, it's hugely contested for a number of reasons. So what happened? Imagine you are in that 40 to 60 to 80 years before the Gospels. What sources are you using? Maybe other Gospels, but a lot of oral tradition. So who's told you these things? Well, someone's come all the way over from maybe Jerusalem, has gone to Corinth and spread some stuff. And then someone from Corinth has told other people from Corinth, and thingy tells thingy, and thingy tells thingy, right? So you're getting your stories literal stories are being told from one person to the other. Now, what do we know about stories? How do we measure stories' effectiveness? They aren't. No one is telling the story or listening to a story going, I'm sorry, I don't know that's 100% true, or they're not even going, that's not 100% true, so therefore I'm sorry, I'm going to contest your story, because they don't know what's 100% true. Neither of them know what's 100% true. So how do they measure the success of a story? Well, on the effect it has on the audience.
Yeah. So Papias did this. According to Eusebius, Papias, the church father, was more of a fan of oral testimony than he was of written testimony. So he was more, okay, tell me that story about Jesus. He did what? He grew 300 feet tall? Hold on. Now I'm making that up. I'm just making the point, especially when it comes to Judas. Like, you hear about Judas and his bowels and the worms, and he was twice the size of a wagon, and the land still stinks till this day. Like, people really get sucked into these stories.
And you get the non-canonical Gospels that have some pretty incredible stuff. And what happens is you get this arbitrary line of acceptance where you get, right, these 4 Gospels are not bonkers, and these ones are bonkers. So we're going to draw the line here, and we're going to keep these 4 Gospels. It might be to do their 4 winds, it might be to do this and that, but the idea is that they're somehow more respectable and less nonsensical than the other Gospels, or less fanciful than the other Gospels, as if they're not incredibly fanciful. In Matthew, you've got zombies parading around Jerusalem that apparently everyone saw. You've got the veil of the temple being ripped into. You've got earthquakes, and you've got darkness, and you've got resurrection of a God-man spirit, and all this kind of stuff. It's like, that's still completely incredible and extraordinary. And yet you've drawn a line there, and I would have drawn a line before those Gospels. I wouldn't have believed any of them, right? But you are telling stories, and the effect, the success of the story is depending on what your objective is in telling that story, right?
Yeah.
It's not about the facticity of that story. It's not about, I've got like 12 facts that I need to deliver to this person. This person needs to remember those 12 facts in exactly the way I tell them. No one tells a story like that. Even with like singing, there's lots of research that Ehrman pulls on to do with Slavic poetry and these different kind of oral traditions, and no oral tradition works like that. No oral tradition works in a way of like, we are trying to distill all these like facts into this piece of oral, orality, and then I'm going to deliver that, and you're going to take it on in exactly the same way that I deliver it. It's just, nothing works like that. So the belief the Gospels could maintain the accuracy over time and then write it down as accurately as when it first happened is just pure fanciful nonsense.
Yeah, there are some scholars that do suggest that there's like a kernel of sayings, let's say, that maybe came from Jesus. So they're trying to retain that. And one of those, for example, in Matthew that you were talking about, where he talks about, you will not have gone through all the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Like, the end, they wouldn't even have, the mission to the Gentiles wasn't even going to happen yet, according to this saying. If you read it in Matthew, it's like, where's the mission of the Gentiles and the Son of Man comes? Like, that would have happened after the coming of the Son of Man, based on this idea, because they would only go in the city, the houses of Israel. There was no mission of Gentiles yet. Yeah. So there's people who think not only that, it kind of flops on its face and they say it failed. There's a scholar I interviewed yesterday who says it didn't. He thinks it, he doesn't think that makes sense. He's like, why would Matthew add in failed prophecy, add in a saying from the Lord that didn't come true? That makes no sense to him. But other scholars across the board think it does make sense that if a saying came from Jesus, that they would probably keep it or give it its own little tweak.
So Ehrman talks about gist memories. So what are the gist memories that that we can see from the whole resurrection narrative that we think might be true? And there are elements of, like, Jesus came into Jerusalem, Jesus annoyed some religious some of the religious authorities, so much so that he was executed, and so on and so forth. So there are these basic facts, if you like, that you can glean from the whole narrative. And then there might be these sayings as well. So Jesus, because he must have been quite a charismatic leader, if you're a historicist, that is. So if you believe that he existed, then he has generated this following, as any charismatic leader. I mean, there's nothing unusual, and will say a bunch of things that your followers are going to remember. Otherwise, what's the point in them following you? You've got to have some content that you are delivering, right? Some ideas. So they could well be remembering these sayings, which is why the sayings are important within the construction of the Gospels, and you get these sayings that repetitively come up throughout each of the Gospels and whatnot. So it could be not only that there's some gist events that happened that were true, but also there are some sayings in the Gospels that Jesus said might well be true, right? But other than that, all the fanciful, actual, crazy stuff, clearly not. Is my opinion. So so what another argument so going on to fourth argument or is it the third argument from William Lane Craig, is that the account is unembellished, and he talks about Mark being the most reliable because it's the earliest and the simplest. He says that the others, quote, are colored by theological and other developments. I think that's really interesting that William Lane Craig is saying, I think the empty tomb is true because the narrative is fairly unembellished, and that Mark is certainly seems to be less embellished than the others, so therefore we can rely on it being true, which is to imply that all the other Gospels are less reliable, that all those embellishments didn't happen. Is this William Lane Craig saying, Mark is definitely true because he's earliest and least embellished. Therefore, all the others are not reliable because they're later and more embellished.
Right. It sounds that way because he admits he's opening the window for theology, which to me is a way of saying he's opening the window for legend. Yeah. Even though he's not going to use the term legend, though. I had Del Allison Jr., who is a believer, Christian, but an expert on the New Testament, who turned around and was like, yeah, there's legend, there's theology, and there's probably some kernels of history. And he even admits, like, even what we have isn't what really happened. There's usually a development of maybe what happened. So there's a memory. He kept using the term, maybe a memory behind what's said here of what happened. And, I ask myself all the time, like, how did Jesus die? What did he do again? Did he say he was God? Did he cleanse the temple? They said, hell no. And they're going to kill this guy for insurrection and going into the temple. That makes the most sense a lot of times if you look at it. But there's different theories about what would have happened and how. And there's just, at the end of the day, the memory is this guy ended up bucking against the religious leaders of the time. And they said, no, out. Let's take care of this guy.
I think that there's a real problem to say that Mark is the least embellished, therefore it's not embellished. It's like there's a British rapper called Dave who had this song called Black, and there's a live version of the song which is absolutely insanely brilliant. But one of the lines of the song is a black guy saying, one of the lines is because it comes from something that's quoted in politics, which is, I think it might have been something like Boris Johnson saying he was the least or someone saying of Boris Johnson, he's the least racist person. And Trump said these kind of things and Dave said the least racist person is still racist. Do you know? So if you've got a whole range of people who are racist and say that guy's the least racist, right, it's not to say he's not racist, right? So I'm not tainting the Bible with racism here, but what I'm saying is that, the analogy is that here we've got 4 Gospels and they're all nonsense, right? But to say that one's the least nonsense is not to say therefore it's all true. is just to say it's the least embellished or the least legendary. Yeah,
Right.
but it's still entirely legendary, arguably, or could be entirely legendary. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I totally get it.
I think to say it's the least embellished, it doesn't do for William Lane Craig what I think.
So the question then for William Lane Craig is he suggesting all of Mark is actually historical, and that then, meaning everything as you see it is historical, or is he admitting there's a lot of theology there too? Because if you start to say, well, there's a ton of theology here as well, but it's far more theology in Matthew, Mark, and John, then who is the one who's correctly knowing what's theology and what's real history
exactly
here? This is not an easy question to answer.
And the further problem is that it's to suggest that that the others are theologically more adorned. It's actually also a little bit problematic, because lots of the theology really did happen in Mark as well. And actually, I'm going to read you a quote from Geoffrey Lauder from this book, one of his own chapters in the book I showed you earlier, The Empty Tomb. And here's a quote on page 198 of my book. And most of the theological and other developments, that's William Lane Craig's quote, in the latter documents are found precisely within the sections that the Markan account of the resurrection lacks. Most of the motifs listed by Craig as legendary, including a description of the resurrection itself, reflection on Jesus' triumph over sin and death, quotation of fulfilled prophecy, or description of the risen Jesus, are found within the empty tomb stories of the Gospel of Peter and the ascension of Isaiah. In other words, while the resurrection stories in both the Gospel of Peter and the ascension of Isaiah are theologically adorned, the empty tomb stories of both accounts do not appear to be significantly more theologically adorned than that of the Gospel of Mark. So I think, and that's the end of the quote. So I think, William Lane Craig is just trying to have his cake and eat it.
Oh yeah. Keep the door open. Keep the door open. We may not have it all figured out, but there's something there, come on. But it's 100% true. And I'm willing to go debate for 30 years in front of everyone on planet Earth and make sure they know that this is true. And if I'm wrong about all of this, it doesn't matter, because my inside witness of the Holy Spirit is evidence enough to know what I believe is true. That's pretty much what it boils down to for him.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, do we accept these claims on historical grounds of mere gospel assertion? This is what it comes down to. These claims of an empty tomb, these are just mere assertions. And I think claiming that this one's the least adorned and therefore more probable is still just an assertion. You're still just a gospel asserting this out of nowhere. And the problems of these are the problems of the gospels as a whole, as the sources they are. You've got another.
Aryan, thank you. No New Testament author claims that his book is divine. And that's an interesting point. None of them are saying that this is a divine book, but it does take on its own status within the Christian church of authoritarian. I mean, but even the idea that the books are divine, what inspiration means in early church versus what Protestants think it means is a whole different question as well, because the church itself has this really, they play as much a role in how one is viewing these texts and such when it starts to develop later on in late second, third centuries, and you start going onward. Whereas Protestants want to go back to the text and scratch the church, but there's a lot there. There's a lot there to unravel. But yeah, they didn't say, hey, this book right here is divinely, and this is the divine book. I think that later potential pastoral epistles indicate maybe.
Yeah, because that's a really good point. Actually, we kind of forget really about the realities of the Gospels being written, because we look at the Bible as this sacrosanct book, right, that has the New Testament in it, of which the four Gospels have this amazingly privileged position in people's religious lives. But actually, there is no real epistemic. There's some historiographical, arguably, a difference between, say, the Gospel of Peter or the secret book of James or whatever, the non-canonical Gospels and the canonical Gospels, other than some group of people have decided to make these special and these ones not. But realistically, when they're actually writing them, they are writing these for their community, to deliver some kind of story or some kind of understanding of Jesus that they had. And so we forget that they were all doing this, and that the non-canonical gospel writers must have had communities of people who believed some of these, what we might see as really quite outlandish things about
but
Jesus.
they believed them. Yeah.
But they believed them, you know. And so therefore it's just a sliding scale. And the fact that you arbitrarily cut it off here is, I think, exactly that, arbitrary. And I think they're all just nonsense, but you will draw the line down there and say, well, these ones are nonsense, but these ones are fine, is problematic.
So continue, please.
Well, so the next point that William Lane Craig is that the woman finding the tomb, he finds is really likely. As to not likely. He finds that as being supportive of the historical nature of the empty tomb claim. So he says that the women were not legal eyewitnesses, or it was the criterion of embarrassment, right? So the idea that it's embarrassing to say women found them first, so therefore it's probably more likely they really did, because they wouldn't write something that's if they're going to make something up, they're not going to make up something that's going to be embarrassing. But the idea is, well, yeah, okay, but actually women played a really, really large part in the early church.
Mm-hmm.
Women played a large part in the Gospels, actually. So therefore, this fits in. It also fits in with the motif of reversal of expectation we talked about before, which is you expect the apostles to come and do all this stuff. It ends up not being them. It ends up being people who you maybe expect less. But also, the apostles have run away, right? So who is going to be left? Well, it's only going to be the woman left. And actually, who does embalm bodies or anoint them usually? It's usually the women who do that. So therefore, once you start piecing it all together, it's highly likely it's going to be the woman. So I don't think this fits in with that narrative that William Lane Craig is trying to deliver here. That
this is the hard part I had when I read Dale Allison's book on the resurrection. He takes a position where he thinks this is a historical kernel. And I told him, I said, I think this is one of your weak points personally, because he says the early church was androcentric. Men are the main focus and not women at all. You can kind of get these potential indications when you look in Paul's letters, when there's time, be silent, this and that. But when you read in 1 Corinthians 15, the earliest account, there is no mention of a woman coming to the tomb, or women came to his burial, since he doesn't mention a tomb. He literally just says he was buried. No women show up, nothing.
Yeah.
So he says, see, androcentrism, because we have this gospel account where women show up, and Paul's being androcentric, just being quiet about this. We think that the gospel accounts are a memory of an earlier historical nugget where a woman or women come to this burial at the tomb. And there's a lot of problems with that, in my opinion. But I suspect in the next chapter, we're probably going to get further into this. But just long story short, I want to make is, if they were androcentric, then why does Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and John have women come to the tomb at all? I mean, every gospel has them show up, but Paul wants to leave that out. Yeah, it's really odd. It just more of a,
and then narrative. It's made even odder by the fact that they all have women turning up, but they all have different women turning up, or like combinations of, and then it's all just thoroughly problematic. Yeah, so I think this idea that the women were an embarrassing thing is a little bit. Yeah, I don't find it holds much purchase there for me, at any rate. So the next one that William Lane Craig talks about is the apostles inspecting the tomb is really likely. So therefore, this shows some kind of historical credibility somehow, that because they verified the tomb, then that's great. But this opens up a right can of worms, particularly for William Lane Craig, because he's told us previously that Mark he finds as earlier and simpler, and therefore more reliable, right? So what happens at the end of Mark with the woman at the tomb? Can you remember?
With Mark in particular, there's a man dressed in a white robe who tells her, go to Galilee where Jesus has said, or something like that, he's not here, or something to this effect, and go tell the men. But of course they don't go and tell the men. It's kind of an embarrassing ending, so to speak, actually.
So what happens is they run away and don't tell anyone.
Right.
So I mean, so bear in mind, right? So Mark has them running away and staying silent, and William Lane Craig saying that's the earliest and most reliable. So the most reliable one is the women don't tell anyone, which is arguably also Mark's excuse as to why the empty tomb narrative has never been heard before. So I think this is interesting. I think this is important. So this fits again with
how come we haven't heard about this empty tomb before? Well, duh, don't you know? They went and didn't tell anybody, but we know now.
And thank you very much. Yes, so William Lane Craig says, "Oh, there's a pre-Markan narrative of an empty tomb." No, there isn't, and we know that because of Matthew's guards at tomb, like I've explained already, but also because Mark. Why would Mark say the woman ran away and didn't tell anyone and was silent, right? Mm-hmm. And yet Matthew, Luke, and John all have the woman not staying silent, literally running away and telling people straight away who come back and verify the tomb, right? So you cannot have it both ways. You cannot have it that either they were silent, and didn't tell anyone, mm-hmm. or that Mark is reliable and early. You just can't.
This reminds me of Steve Mason. I had Dr. Mason on, and I asked him about is Mark's agenda Pauline? And of course, most scholars say, yeah, there's definitely Pauline theology in Mark, right? This is what most of the scholars I talk about. But there's an interesting thing also that's happening in Mark where the Gospel of Mark paints the 12 as dimwits, idiots that don't get it.
That's a reversal of expectation motif, yeah.
Yeah, and if at the outro of this actual original, what we would expect Mark to be, not the verses that are interpolated after, but the ones that originally end with, and they went off, they were afraid and told nobody.
Yeah.
If this is the case, I wonder if this is a jab, and I mentioned this to Dr. Mason, this was a jab at the 12, the other apostles' Christianity, and Paul's trying to say, look, they didn't know this. It was divine revelation that revealed this to Paul and not the 12, which is, it's kind of a conspiracy theory in a way to consider, but it's very plausible because Paul paints himself in weird places against the 12. And if Mark is batting for Paul in some way, and he's saying the 12 are dimwits, the least of all, the last apostle, that is Paul, he got divine revelation. And where the women didn't even tell the 12, don't worry, God revealed this to Paul. And that Paul was the real man. You see what I'm saying? And it's a pro-Pauline. Then Matthew comes to defend the 12. And if you read Matthew, the 12 look smart. They understand the answers. They get everything. He makes the apostles look good. So here you have the 12 looking good in Matthew after they looked bad in Mark. And he's painting a Jewish Christianity, not a pro-Gentile Paulinish type. So I don't know.
This goes back to what I said about audience purpose form. So when you're doing any kind of writing or communication, you need to consider who your audience are and what your objective is, what your purpose is. So what am I delivering and who are my audience? And so Matthew has a different agenda. He's delivering it to a different audience. So therefore he's going to write different things to what Mark has, who has a different agenda and a different audience. Therefore you get differences. And Luke has a Gentile audience. So he's going to be delivering things in a way that's possibly not coherent with what Matthew says.
Right.
Completely what you'd expect, but that doesn't sit well with people who just have to have everything, all four are basically just different viewpoints of the same narrative.
Yeah,
it's like, no, there are four different agendas, as you expect with any kind of writing. No, as we said before.
Tangent. I went on.
No, but that it's definitely very interesting. That so what you have, as I say, is Mark having the women, and they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And everything after that is an interpolation. So Mark 16:9 onwards is in brackets in most Bibles because it's commonly known to be, commonly thought to be interpolated, which then goes on to sort of resurrection events. But appearance events. But yeah, so you have them being silent, and then you have Matthew, Luke, and John having the disciples, the apostles, coming back and verifying the tomb. So Luke, interestingly, however, is seen as an interpolation of John. So the line, I forget which one it is. Is it Luke? I'll tell you actually, because I've got Luke in front of me. But it's thought that, is it 24:12? Yes. I think 24, Luke 24:12. Nevertheless, Peter got up and ran to the tomb. And when he stooped and looked in, he saw the linen wrappings only, and he went away to his home, marveling at what had happened. Is thought to be an interpolation and basically nicked off John. You don't have anyone verifying in Matthew, I think, which basically leaves. So if you're saying that Luke is an interpolation, as the verification verse is an interpolation, Matthew, there's no verification. You've only got John having the apostles verifying. So when William Lane Craig is saying, and this leads towards a belief that the empty tomb is reliable because they're verified, the apostles are verifying. Arguably, only John has the apostles verifying, and Mark has the very explicitly the woman staying silent. So this is a real problem for William Lane Craig's approach.
Dude, when you take a magnifying glass to these, I mean, you really, it's like that really good filter that someone might put on. I watched this little video just to be funny for a second, where this guy's in a bar and they're all drunk and they're sitting there and they see these really hot chicks in the corner, like, dude, and he's like, bro, chill. Like some guru comes on, chill, bro, look. And he takes his fingers and he goes, look between those lines, and then zoom in, and then you see, and he's like, oh, and it's like, you look close, you start seeing like, whoa, my drunk eyes are really, really like, whoa, she's not as hot as I thought. Well, that is like this. When we were Christians, the whole story, it was fine. I didn't even want to zero in on this stuff. It was all about just having my story be true, because my experience. At the end of the day, when you delve close, man, I could see why people want to fight and argue. No, the ending of Mark is not interpolated. We're going to make a case to try and still make that original, and that it got knocked off or whatever. And it's possible. We're not ruling it out. But when it's possible, it's like that Jim Carrey phrase off Dumb and Dumber at the end, where he's like, will you date me? And she like, what are the odds? And she's like 1 in a million. And he's like, so you're telling me there's a chance? And he's like, that's what I feel.
So this is what Richard Carrier coined, this possibility ergo probability fallacy. And it's basically my favorite fallacy, as in it's a fallacy that I pick out most commonly from Christians, which is to say, oh, this could have happened. It might have happened. And then they jump from, it's a possibility, therefore it is what happened. So they go from a possibility to they jump almost past probability to a certainty. They go like, oh, it's possibly what happened, therefore it's probably what happened, therefore it is what happened.
Right, and they do that with 10 to 12 criteria. Next thing you know, you have a whole house of cards that are solid brick in their eyes, and you're going, what led you there to begin with? Hold on, let's start with the first card that you put to build this house of cards. Let's be, and they don't ask questions. They don't just go, what I mean is this. I'm not going to say they don't ask questions, but they don't just go, I don't know. They don't just admit and say, look, I can't be confident and certain based on the material we have. I will say my experience. If they admitted that, at least they're being honest and saying, it's really my experience. And when I came to apply this and I prayed and I'm in the social structure of a church or whatever, that would be fair, even if I think that it can be explained, like we talked about when you were interviewing me. At the end of the day, though, that's not what I see. What I see is they act like this is a knockout home run hit. It's evident, and it's not. It's really, really not.
And then when you get people like William Lane Craig saying, well, actually, the women were the criterion of embarrassment, so therefore it's more likely to be true because they wouldn't have chosen people who were embarrassing people, women, to testify here. But because of that, this is why the apostles had to come back and verify, right? So, but then we say, well, actually, it looks like only John has the apostles to coming back to verify. So you're saying this wasn't important for Mark, so therefore this is completely undoing your own argument. I mean, it's just, you can't have it both ways. You've got the the gospel is saying different things, and you are saying these gospels that say completely different things are united by this one argument I'm saying, but if they're saying different things, it can't be united by that one argument, because it's not, because that one argument supports either that one or that one. So, jog on. So I think the penultimate argument that I put forward for William Lane Craig was they would not have declared it as empty had it not actually been empty. And he uses kind of the idea that it happened in Jerusalem, and he uses this as historically backing up the truth of the empty tomb claim. And you get this idea that as if well, first of all, the nascent Christian sect was secretive, and even according to Acts, they didn't really start shouting about it till 50 days later, right? So imagine this is actually what happened, that they think Jesus resurrected, then they eventually come around to shouting about it, because Mark tells us the woman was silent straight away. But if you believe John, maybe the apostles came back. But even then, as I said, they didn't shout about it for 50 days. Now, after 50 days, what's going to be happening when someone says, our great leader resurrected and is the Messiah or is God and is resurrected into heaven? As a Jew, after 50 days, how can you prove this or disprove it? You can't. No body is recognizable. No, there's Mishnah, the oral law. There's Jewish law tradition that states that you can't, you can't dig up bones, you can't look at bodies, you can't do this, you can't recognize a body after so long, and X, Y, and Z. So this is completely impractically impossible that you would get the Jewish authorities digging up some bones to verify whether this was Jesus or not, because you wouldn't have been able to tell. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've even got certain quotes within the gospel itself. Some talk about like 4 days, I think it's in Acts or something, that after 4 days the stench of a body is so much. So 50 days is completely ridiculous. But of course, I mean, the great convenience of all the gospel writers here is that they were writing after the fall of Jerusalem. So none of this is verifiable. So you can't get, they knew that there was no way of checking to see whether the Jewish authorities even did verify it. You could say whatever you like about the whole resurrection narrative, as far as what the Pharisees were doing, or what the high priests were doing, or what the Sanhedrin were doing, or whatever. You can say what you like because no one can verify it, and that's indeed what it looks like. But Jewish midrash shows that after 3 days, a body is too disfigured for the soul to return. So even after 3 days, it's starting to disfigure. So are you going to be able to verify this body is who it supposedly is? And the resurrection, and it's this idea that, according to people like William Lane Craig, so it's got to be true because X, Y, and Z, and the verifiability of everything going on. There's no Jewish sources that show even mention of a resurrection until much later, right? In other words, no one was going around saying Jesus has just been resurrected. So no one would have been able to verify it because no one was talking about it. As I was saying, the Christian sect was secretive, and they were a nascent sect, and therefore the Jewish sources didn't mention it because the Christians weren't mentioning it. Because I doubt even the Christians had an empty tomb narrative for another 40 years. So it's just the whole idea that this plays into the historical reliability, according to William Lane Craig, because it was verifiable, and yet it
This really makes the mind have to work a little. And I say that because when you've been told the story, when you've read the story, and I say the story, notice how I did one. Like I just singular, like this is all one cohesive thing. And you go from Mark, and here you are at Acts, you're already having this picture in your mind that these Christians are standing in front of the Areopagus or the Areopagus, if you will, in Athens, or they're standing before all these people in front of governors and lords and this and that, and they're preaching this message and everyone hears it. So Christians automatically in their apologetics will say, well, the Sanhedrin could have easily came and debunked them out the gate because if they were preaching this message. No, we really don't know the early movement. We don't see them running to rooftops screaming the Christian message out the gate. I don't think that would have been the case, and we have no evidence that that's what they were doing. There's no reason to...
And worse still, that it's a bit like the Egyptian scenario I always talk about, which is, you know, all these plagues and terrible things, and still the Egyptians didn't believe, right? And like we talked about with the Matthew's guards of the tomb, you know, they see this resurrection arguably, and they didn't believe. So with the if the Jewish authorities were verifying and seeing that there was no body in the tomb, then they would be going, oh my goodness, maybe they're right. You know, that you'd be seeing like this idea that Christianity could be the real thing, but actually it's just complete silence, and it only pops up sort of 40 to 80 years later in a bunch of gospel accounts.
Well, that's the thing, the dating problem. See, that's where Walter, who commented, it's like they never read the New Testament. Trust me, I've read the New Testament, my friend. Here's where you got to do a little bit of work. And I don't know if you're actually willing to do that, because I've seen your comments before, and I'm not trying to be derogatory. I'm just pointing out the facts. When you're reading Acts, if you watched my 4-hour section with Dr. Steve Mason, he went out of his way to prove, like, I mean, he's super humble, but what he said was so convincing that not only does Acts know Josephus, not just Josephus' early Wars of the Jews, but Antiquities, the whole nine, like he knows the 93 AD literature, which means Luke would have been written after 93 AD, which means if Jesus has died in 30, whatever narrative Luke is painting in his text is written at least 50 years or so later, and it's trying to project this narrative. And if you consider what Jonathan's saying, the early church isn't doing what Acts is saying to a T. This is a narrative. This is a story. Then what you have is you have what Christians are arguing for as facts. The early church was saying this out loud. Someone could have debunked them. No, we don't know what the actual early church was doing, especially since Luke Acts got a lot of this material wrong, or he's quoting Josephus on things that, what is the point? Go watch that 4-hour episode with Steve Mason, and you'll walk away going, wow, okay, this is interesting. This paints a whole nother narrative. So this later dated stuff creates a big problem on supposing these Christians would have just been proven wrong or debunked out the gate, especially if they were very secretive.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And you know, they were a very. I'm going to read you another Jeff Lauder quote. So Robert L. Wilkin, a Christian historian, points out that, quote, for almost a century, Christianity went unnoticed by most men and women in the Roman Empire. Non-Christians saw the Christian community as a tiny, peculiar, antisocial, religious sect, drawing its adherents from the lower strata of society, close quote. First century Romans had about as much interest in refuting Christian claims as 20th century skeptics had in refuting the misguided claims of the Heaven's Gate cults. They simply didn't care to refute it. As for the Jews, Jewish sources do not even mention the resurrection, much less attempt to refute it. As Martin writes, quote, this hardly suggests that Jewish leaders were actively engaged in attempting to refute the resurrection story, but failing in their efforts, close quote. Mm-hmm. It perfectly sums it all up, which is to say, you know, no one was interested in refuting it because the claims weren't really clearly there in the public sphere. And so therefore, to use this idea that it happened in Jerusalem and would have been verified, and therefore this makes it more historically reliable, is absolute nonsense.
Hey, did you know that there was a Loch Ness monster and Bigfoot traveling around in Hiroshima, but after the nuclear waste, there's no way to really know. I can't prove it, but it happened. It happened.
How convenient.
I mean, it's quite convenient, but it's true. Make sure you guys know that.
Definitely happened because, you know, it would have been verified by the people at the time.
Yeah. I mean, we believe it happened. So why wouldn't we believe it happened if it didn't happen? Yeah.
So the last one that William Lane Craig says is there's this Jewish polemic, i.e. the Jews claim that the body was stolen as a counter argument. So that counter argument proves that there was an empty tomb, right? Yes, it does. No, sorry. It proves there was a narrative of an empty tomb later written, right? So when were the earliest Jewish sources saying that? Well, we've only got secondhand evidence of this, or tertiary evidence of this. So you've got you know, claims from Justin Martyr, you know, Contra Celsus, and all these claims of Jewish polemicists who unfortunately we don't have the original documents of. So we only have the replies that early Christians had to them. So that's a bit of a shame. But these aren't documents that were coming out of, you know, pre-Markan time periods. So all we have is that there was a Jewish polemic in answer to what Mark wrote, and Mark wrote that post 70 CE. So that the fact that Jews are saying, well, the body could have been stolen, is evidence of the fact that Mark made that claim later, not evidence that it actually happened.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's just this whole later dating thing will throw a wrench in your mind if you're a believer and you already have this idea. Now, some believers are more advanced in their research. They understand this being a potential thing to consider, but I don't know if they let that carry heavy weight against what they're suggesting. Even our good friend Caleb Jackson that you had a debate discussion with, you know, he's very smart. You could tell he knows a lot of this stuff. But at the end of the day, is he allowing that later stuff to carry weight, to put a big question mark at the end of the day?
It's all about confirmation bias. It's all about how much evidential value or how much value you ascribe to any given piece of evidence. And if it supports your worldview, and it's the same for us as it is for Christians, right? But you just need to be aware of that, because am I giving that far more value because it supports my own view? Which at the end of the day, Caleb and I have exactly the same access to exactly the same evidence, right? And we have completely different conclusions. So therefore, both of us are ascribing different values to the same bits of evidence.
Right. And then when these later books can't even agree with one another, this is the problem. I mean, that should really drop, I think, confidence on trying to have conclusive evidence that this proves anything. It doesn't.
I mean, the difference is my evaluation is right and his is wrong. But you know. So as far as so just to draw this to a close, as far as arguments, so that's William Lane Craig's arguments, I think don't hold up, right? So I think the empty tomb is, I don't think you can support the historical veracity of the empty tomb. And this is a problem more for theists, for Christians, than it is for atheists, because the empty tomb is far more necessary for the Christian thesis than a lack of empty tomb is, you know, damning for the skeptic's thesis, right? So
right.
But there's a couple of other little problems to throw in. So first of all, round discs on a disc-shaped sort of doorway, stone to tombs, were not a thing. They were not a thing until after 70 CE, and even then, I think we've only got 4 disc-shaped stones found out of about 900 tombs, and they belong to the really super wealthy. Was this a really super wealthy tomb? Almost certainly not. It's an empty tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, who was a prominent Sanhedrin member, but it looks unlikely. But also, they weren't around at that time. So, okay, we've got a problem with this stone being rolled away. It's more likely to be a rectangular tombstone. You know what I mean? It's tomb door. The further problem is, if you're a couple of women going to anoint or embalm or whatever it is, and we'll talk about that next time because that's problematic. But if you're going to do whatever you're going to do to this body, and you're going to get to this tomb, and there's a massive stone in the way that you're going to be unable to shift, I mean, what's going on there? I mean, one of them has a real Deus ex machina again, like, oh, they even question how they're going to remove the stone, and then suddenly it's removed anyway because the angels have moved it. And, oh, how lucky is that? But I mean, this is like, what's going on here? This story doesn't make any sense. They're getting up in the middle of the night really to walk here because it's going to be dark, or it is dark. And again, we'll talk about problems with timing in the next one. But they get there without any way of opening up to do the work they're going to do. I mean, this is kind of really poor forethought. So I think the whole stone issue it doesn't really help matters, because I think it's just another little nugget that shows that the story is incoherent and not historically plausible.
Someone did say that the Rolling Stones, this is the first Rolling Stones. I think that you have. And then Walter says, this makes I don't know if Walter thinks about what he says before he says it. I honestly don't, but I'm trying. I'm trying here, Walter. Please bear with me. You need a book for a story to be true. ... Great scholarship happening. I hope you recognize the Prophet Muhammad, and I hope you recognize the Prophet Joseph Smith. They started off with oral tradition, just like Christianity. You really need to consider those prophets as part of your paradigm, because Joseph Smith is true, and the angel Moroni showed him the golden plates. And you really need to repent and come to the Mormon Church, and also convert to Islam. So you need to, since your methodology is that way, you really should expand, that horizon of what you believe, my friend, and start believing in much more than what you already do, because so many of these religions are based off oral tradition, and they're all true. Just remember that. So, yeah.
There is a quote I forgot to add in, so I'm going to go back to the verifiability idea of the empty tomb story. So the idea that the Jewish authorities would have verified this. There's Dr. Humayun Siddiqui, who he's written a great book on. He's an anthropologist, actually, on sort of hallucinations and resurrection accounts and stuff. It's a really, really good book. But a quote from that is, the assertion about the public display of a corpse is based on four presuppositions. One, that the Jews and the general public knew precisely where the grave was located. Two, that the Galilean missionaries who came back to Jerusalem were outstandingly successful. Three, that Caiaphas and his colleagues had an urgent need to refute the proclamations of the Jesus cultists about their risen rabbi. Four, that the biblical narratives about Jesus's burials are accurate. There are no grounds for accepting any of these suppositions. And I add, one can add some further arguments here. 5, Jewish law held that identification of bodies after just 3 days was illegal and never admissible in court, specifically due to expected decay. 6, exhuming a dead body for any purpose was punishable by death in both Roman and Jewish law. Therefore, this whole narrative was neither verifiable nor falsifiable, even if one had wanted to check the claims being made. Right. And I think that basically puts that to bed. You couldn't have verified the empty tomb anyway. There's just no way it could have been done. So, for as far as I'm concerned, the empty tomb didn't happen, as in there wasn't an empty tomb, precisely because Jesus wouldn't have been buried in the tomb at all. And if I was to accept the next most likely account, so I don't think there's a tomb at all, but if you're going to push me towards there definitely was a tomb somehow, I would say the only way you get a tomb is if Jesus' body, and I explained this last time, Jesus' body was taken down before sunset as per Jewish law, because dead bodies couldn't be left on a post after sunset. So it was taken down before sunset and was buried very temporarily in an empty tomb. And maybe his followers saw that was a tomb he was in. And then after the Sabbath, authorities moved that body from an empty tomb to the criminal's graveyard. But Jesus' followers went back to that tomb, thinking that's where he was buried permanently, and he wasn't there. So they go, oh, there's an empty tomb. And out of that, you get the empty tomb narrative and resurrection and hallucination developments.
And I mean, as early as you can go, even in Mark, you're going to find, where did my master go? Where did my Lord go? Like, there's this idea that he's not there. So if there is a kernel, like you said, that fits the best criteria. And here's where cognitive dissonance sets in. It's interesting.
I think it's cognitive dissonance from there on in. So, but personally, I don't think even that's plausible, because I think that if you were a criminal being executed for high treason, you are condemned to the worst kind of burial, the worst death and the worst burial. So he would have been stoned and not crucified, and then would have been buried in a criminal's graveyard, in the graveyard of the stoned and burned, which that's just what would have happened, and so I don't think you've got a space for an empty tomb even.
Interesting. Well, ladies and gentlemen, go subscribe to Jonathan's YouTube channel, A Tippling Philosopher. We're trying to get him over 1,000 subs here. We're at 752. I'm going to post that here for you guys and gals now, so you can go subscribe. Even Walter is invited to come harass him over there, since he has to be heard over here. He has to... He's flexing his theological muscles and showing why his religion's true. Here it is. I just commented. Make sure you go over there, Walter, and subscribe, and maybe you'll learn a thing or two from a skeptic. And also, you have the Amazon book. Let me hit back here so everybody can go and get the book. We're still carrying on in the series, The Resurrection, a critical examination of the Easter story. It is down in the, I've got a link down in the description where you guys can click and go check it out. Make sure you get the book. We're still continuing. We're on page.
So we get up to chapter 16, which is the women at the tomb.
Yep. 207 for those who are
next one
along.
We'll be discussing that. That'll probably be a short one because I think the one after that is quite a big one to do with whether it was a spiritual or a bodily resurrection.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's going to unpack a lot of stuff. So, yeah. Looking forward to the series. I'm excited. I always have a blast when I do these. And also, ladies and gentlemen, consider becoming a patron of MythVision. I always mention this because this helps me go full time. I have some plans to go and interview more scholars in person. If you become a patron, I'll let you know heads up when I plan on going to see certain scholars. If you have a question as a patron member and you want to message it to me to have it, recorded with these scholars, as long as it's relevant and it's in the vein of their research, you can have a video in your own name. I mean, that's the little advantage I do. It's my way of trying to help grow and keep MythVision alive as you guys coming and supporting, but also making history. So in 30 years from now, 20 years from now, you can click an old video that's on the internet where you could say, that was me. My name was mentioned. I asked that scholar. That scholar may not even be around anymore. They may be history at this point, unless they rose from the dead too.
Yeah,
but
that's what I'm planning. I've got it all planned out.
Yeah.
I suggest everyone Patreons you because, quite frankly, the work you do is awesome.
Thank you.
This notwithstanding, but some of the scholars you get on are just absolutely fantastic. So you are doing a wonderful job, mate.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Till next time, ladies and gentlemen. I'm excited. I'm excited to continue the series. We got shocked with an early day today. I hope you watched this and learned a thing or two.
My bad.
Yeah. Absolutely. Let's go ahead and look at Naked Jesus on our way out the show and go subscribe.
All good things come to those who wait.
Absolutely. This is the special part where we get to finally see Jesus naked.